Hello, my name is Connor,
And I'm Jason.
and you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So today we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 7, verses 29 through 35. And to me, it's a bit of an, kind of confusing maybe, or interesting passage. And so I'm excited for us to dig into it. It begins in verse 29. It says, "All the people, even the tax collectors, when they heard Jesus' words, acknowledged that God's way was right, because they had been baptized by John. But the Pharisees and the experts in the law rejected God's purpose for themselves, because they had not been baptized by John." Jesus went on to say, "To what then can I compare the people of this generation? What are they like? They are like children sitting in the marketplace and calling out to each other, 'We played the pipe for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not cry.' For John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say, 'He has a demon.' The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, 'Here is a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners.' But wisdom is proved right by all her children." So, as we read through that, what amazes you about that, Connor?
Yeah, I think what amazes me is the insight that Jesus has, I think, into a deep, deep human truth here. There's something so true about the idea that we almost always have made up our mind about a person or made up our mind about a situation before all the facts or all the evidence or even we've come into contact with it. And I like the evidence here of John the Baptist and of Jesus. It's so clear. But then I think about, okay, well, why is that the case? Like, why are people reacting in this specific way? Why are the Pharisees? Why are they reacting in this specific way? It's because they're doing something that is so innately human, something that I do every day, and that if something doesn't fit into my box, the way that I've thought around it, the way that I've made my life up, and I come into contact with it, well, then I already have a pre-described way in which I'm going to sort it, in which I'm going to make sense of it, in which I'm going to make it feel comfortable for me. And I think this is what the heart of why there's so much tension between the Pharisees and Jesus is because Jesus comes in and blows up their box, and they only have two things. Is one, they say my box was not right, the way that I viewed things is incorrectly, or two, the problem is Jesus. The problem is the way it is him. The problem is not within. And it gets to this core idea that so much of the time for myself and for so many, I think for everybody, we come into conflict with something and it makes us feel an icky way. And we have the choice to say, is this coming from me or is it coming from them? And so often for me and in our world, the answer is, well, it's because of them. It's not because it's me. And I've got to come up with all these reasons. And just the insight that Jesus has into people is so... it's so incredible to me.
I think it's fascinating based on other conversations we've had about children and Jesus saying, like two episodes ago, I think, we're talking about we need to be like children and, thinking through what does that look like. And here, and it's interesting, they aren't presented as evil, but they are presented as making these snap judgments, So the assumption would be, if you kind of reverse it, the longer you live, the less snap judgments you should make. And yet the longer I live, the more snap judgments I make because I've got it figured out. I performed a funeral. I never know if I say performed or officiated, but both of them sound awkward.
I'm trying to think what's the most thespian way to say it.
Yeah, exactly. I was the orator. That's not good. Anyway,
you got to roll the R if you're going to say
it. Anyway, so I'm at this funeral, and when you speak at a funeral, at least the way I've been taught to, is you try to dive as deep as you can with the family because you really want to honor the person, but you really want to honor the person that the family knows, which is sometimes interesting when you know the person in a different way. And when I first went in, I was like, oh, it's going to be like this. And I remember even within myself while I'm talking, and I spent a couple hours with the family, but how I'm shifting, I'm almost fighting the shift. I'm like, oh, I feel more compassionate. And I'm like, no, I know there was some tension here, and then I'm owning it, and I'm all judging. I'm like, wait a minute, all this happening inside. And I praise God that I have a robust inside voice in my own head. But because if that came out, I probably wouldn't have done the funeral. But just even watching the funeral yesterday, because one of the dynamics is one of the family members was very reluctant. I don't want to speak. I don't want to speak. And then once we get everything set up before the funeral, like the funeral's supposed to be starting, the family member comes in and places like an item in the casket. And keep in mind, the funeral is supposed to be starting. Everybody's in place. And they turn around and they present for like 15 minutes. This is true. 15 minutes of what they placed in the casket. And it ended up being beautiful.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't know, like I know you just wait. What are you going to do? Tackle them? And, and there is that part where if they weren't family and I sensed the family was tense, I would have, pressed in and, hey, start the music so we can escort this person off. But it's how this idea of being a disciple, being a learner, is always open to the new, which sounds really romantic. Oh yeah, always open to the new, but the new feels icky.
Oh, that's really good. So that for me, that initial response would be like, they're not sticking to the plan, so I've got to get up there and fix it.
Right.
Where the disciple of Jesus comes in is leaning into that feeling of why do I feel that need to like jump in right now? Why do I feel the need to be the one that fixes this? And like I said, there's a limit there in that specific scenario. But I love that idea. I love that idea of leaning into the new. Sounds romantic, but so often new, we like to think of new as exciting and beautiful, but new is often cautious. New is often uneven ground. It's uncomfortableness. It's awkwardness, and that is so much more. And for me, that is an interesting picture of new, and the fact that Jesus is making all things new, and just what that means. And if I'm a purveyor of this King Jesus that's making all things new, and most new things kind of start with awkwardness and start with uncomfortable feelings, am I meant to be a purveyor of somebody that when I see that awkwardness, I see that weirdness, my initial thought needs to be, that's where Jesus is. That's where Jesus is going to show up.
Yeah, my mind is going like 50 directions. I will lean into what amazes me right now, and we'll let God sort out the rest there. What amazes me is similar. It's Jesus' insight in the human condition, and that the dynamic that it doesn't get better, like it's still the same. And what's interesting is, and every time I really study, in particular the Gospels, I'm struck with the idea when I step back and ask myself the question: would I be the Pharisee here, or would I be the receptive tax collector even? And so many times I'd be the Pharisee. Because like you're saying, I would put him in a box and I would keep grading him, to kind of tighten that up. There's something about our humanness that we want to, and part of it I've heard people talk about, it helps us. There's so much stimuli. We immediately kind of close it down. It's like when you first start to drive a car, there's 100 things to keep track of and it feels really overwhelming. And then today when I drove after, 30 some years of driving, I didn't even notice those things. They're just built
one
in.
fire hydrant, it's good.
Well, yeah, but my car can handle it. And the city's very rich, I think. So it's that idea that I think is his insight, but as amazing is this consistency, how we haven't changed. I come from the church of home improvement, from self-improvement, and we didn't call ourselves that, but it was that idea, if you're a good Christian, you're always improving. And the challenge with focusing more on the improvement than on the, to use that phrase, improver, is the dynamic is I start to trust in my own ability to improve myself. But then the assumption would be, well, generations after generations after generation, we've just gotten better and better and better. And we haven't gotten better and better and better. Now we can always find a point in time or an activity that a certain culture did that we're superior to. But at the end of the day, we're still like these children. And the answer isn't, and this relates to what he says in that parenthetical statement in 29:30, the answer isn't to become more better at being better. The answer is, and I find this fascinating, even that just clicked to me, something else. But the answer is, are you trusting him? Are you? And we talked about the symptom of how you know you're trusting him is when you feel that ickiness of this is new, or maybe say discomfort or instability of this is new. You trust him so much, I don't know how this is going to go, but I believe God will either redeem this bad experience or will make this a good experience. Like it's that fundamental belief. That's called hope in Bible terms. And that's the idea. And what's fascinating to me, because we think about the second phrase where he's talking about, you said John's a drunk and Jesus is a crazy person, wild partier, and so you make those distinctions. But what's fascinating is even in 29, that cause and effect, the people, the tax collectors, they said God's way was right, which is an interesting way to say that. It doesn't say they believed in Jesus, but they were just adhering to this general God's way is right. So that maybe bears some inspection. But the attribution here is because they'd been baptized by John they believed, and the Pharisees, because they hadn't been baptized by John, they didn't believe. So this is where it's like form following function almost, is the idea that whoever accepted plan A left them. I'm not spinning it, but I'm trying to put it in this larger context. Then we're receptive to plan A too. But those who rejected plan A, which is the forgiveness of sins, which is another interesting thing. John was baptizing for the forgiveness of sins. The ones that rejected that part weren't receptive to this part, which then adds to the reason that's important to me is when I reject God's move in the first place, I probably won't accept God's secondary move or his third move. And I wonder sometimes when you see a church growing, that's not your church, that's not your tribe, the name on your door, we usually think to ourselves, oh, they're obviously just, tickling the ears of this generation or whatever, and maybe they are. But I wonder too, why is it we're not getting there? And I wonder sometimes, is it because 5 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, we didn't accept that first move of God, and God's trying to get us to understand, wait a minute, no, I need you to accept this.
Sure.
So we're not even able to hear the second or third, because that's how I see the Pharisees. They're not even able to hear this. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's the symptom of the reason the Pharisees are able to react in this way is because they've gained so much knowledge. Whereas for them, they missed the crucial step at the beginning, right, where they had to divest themselves of the desire to know everything and be able to put everything into a box and ultimately trusting God with that first step. And when we look at other people, we look at another church that we see as successful, this is just very easy. We've all heard this sort of thing, but we see the end result, and even if not even like numerically based, but we see a very mature discipling church. Even if we watch them for 5 years and we've seen them progress, we're seeing step 89 on the progression to that point. And I think the cool thing about the process of becoming a mature follower of Christ is that even the further we go, it's not even like a step process. It's I take a step forward and then I check back with the first step. I check back with the original the original step of trusting God and allowing myself to be amazed and allowing myself to question and to wonder and be okay if he blows up my box, and then going and taking step 90 and checking back in and going, hey, is this still fit in with the plan of God, as opposed to because it's so easy. We've seen people do it we've seen people in ministry who we thought, man, that person is a mature follower of God, and they did it the right way, and they seem to be doing it the right way. Then their ministry blows up, and you go, is it all fake? Was it all wrong? And for some people it is, but I think it also happens is that we checked in for the first few steps and we're doing really well, but then we got to a certain point and we're like, okay, well, if I've got to this step, then I don't need to go back to step 0. I don't need to go back and do these initial checks. And I think this is one of those continual reminders for us. It's for us and for when we look at other people that, one, we're not seeing the full spectrum of the experience of these people following God and being disciples of Jesus. So when we compare ourselves and when we look at how we be successful, it's just an impossibility in a lot of different ways. And two, for us, is if even as successful as we can be, as the steps that we can take, they can always be corrupted if we're not checking in with the core principle that we're talking about here.
I think I can speak to that specifically. That convicts me. I've been at Memorial Drive for 18 years, and it is the church I always wanted to go to, and yet I realize I am in great danger of worshiping the church we have right now. And so we are going to I will miss, and this is the danger too, if I'm the main person that's paying attention to God, if I'm supposed to be because I'm this preacher, then other people will stop paying attention. And if I miss a step, the whole church misses a step, which is why you have to be a learner, encourage other people. Hey, God's going to speak to you too. Let's all be talking about what we see. But it's that idea, because I'm like, hey, it's working. It's working. What if it's not broke, don't fix it. And God never works on that function. He is, based on that language, he is always breaking the fix things. It's like, hey, this is working. And he's like, good. Now we're doing it totally different. Matter of fact, it'll seem almost opposed to the way we did it before. Like we're condemning that way. And he's like, I didn't come to condemn. I came to fulfill. This is what fulfillment looks like, is that you work with this model, this how versus a why or a who or what. You work with this how for a while, learning to trust him with that. And I was like, now here's a new how. And see, that's the thing is, if you're, so Connor being Gen Z, right? There's that sense with the youngest generation, the youngest adult generation, you're like, okay, here's all the stuff we got to work through that they messed up. You know what I mean? But pretty soon, Gen Z will be the old generation, you know, and you're going to be looking at the young generation, and you're going to say to yourself, but we've messed some stuff up, but we built so much good, they're going to mess it up. And God's saying, you should be as excited about, like for me as a Gen Xer, I should be as excited about Gen Z as I ever was about Gen X's possibility. And just as excited about AA. I don't know what comes after Z, but you know what I mean? At that dynamic. And that's the thing. It's because of God. It's not because of the cultural trend or the temperature of the church or the pulse of my congregation. Yeah. It's I trust God that much that as all this topsy-turvy, I'm like, man, what's he going to do with this?
Yeah. So I feel like I've said step way too many times in this podcast, but if we're using this kind of step metaphor, we tend to judge people, generations, systems, religions, churches, groups of people by the steps that we've gotten to. So if we're at step 50, then we're going to judge successive generations, or we're going to judge other churches by how well they meet this standard, by all the steps that we've taken, and they're only here, or they just didn't even take the right path. And I think the thing that you're speaking to, and the thing that I think God is so clearly demonstrating throughout Scripture, is that the measure with which we judge people by is not that they reach this specific level that we've attained or that other generations have attained. It's that they're starting from this core principle of, man, God is going to do something new, and it's going to be weird, and it's going to be awkward, and it's going to be uneven. I think that's exactly what Jesus is speaking to.
So with that in mind, what perplexes me about this passage is this dynamic of, I don't know how to assess anything now. You know what I mean? And part of our role as humans, as humans, but as disciples of Jesus, is discerning. We're called to discern between right and wrong. So if I'm them and I'm like, man, that John the Baptist, he doesn't even drink wine with his meal. Like, he's like ascetic, and he's out in the wilderness. And this other guy, like, we see him at parties, and he's actually creating wine when there wasn't wine before. And so I think, well, that's a pretty good indicator. Now, where I would pause, I'd say, so I need to know more. Whereas used to, I'd be like, so I need to form a judgment, and not speak to him, you know. But still, it's perplexing for me. Where does discernment fit in all this? Because I can't read your heart. I can't read your mind. So I only have your behavior or what you tell me. And see, then I'm just thinking through the process. You will only tell me what you feel safe enough to tell me. So that means I've got to come to you really gentle, unless you're just one of those rare people like, I don't care what you think, here's exactly what's going on in my head, you know. But the majority of people, they respond to the safety that's created, and you're only one part of that conversation if you're trying to make it safe for the other person. So it makes it so hard, I don't even want to do it. I'm just like, I will have no discernment then.
Yeah.
There will be no thinking.
So is the heart here, I'm wondering, you said something about the idea of no, I can't remember exactly how you said it, but something about knowing more. And so is the heart of what it means to be a discerner, it means somebody to be able to do this in a mature and healthy way to help people, not for your own pleasure or your own self-aggrandizing, but to truly love and help people, is the core idea that if I'm going to be a discerner, if I'm going to be somebody that can help determine truth and how to love in a true and right way, the answer is always to dive deeper and to know more. So in the sense of like, okay, I find out that somebody is you're murdering puppies on the side. I can make the discernment that
that's a bad thing.
So I wish you could see the look on Jason's face. I can make the discernment that's wrong and that's bad, and as followers of Jesus, we need to not be doing that. But but like truth, like if our goal is just to be like, we'll label things as right or wrong, well, it's pretty easy to say, okay, well, that's wrong. Let's lock that person up and throw away the keys. But like being a follower of Jesus and somebody who is interested in loving people more than I love myself, the answer is to go deeper. Well, why is that the case? Why, even taken away from, the heinous act of of murdering puppies, you go into something, I'm trying to think of like somebody has a habitual sin that they just keep turning back to, and they keep feeding. And you, as somebody who knows them and loves them, you want to find out, like, you want to help them, but they seem to keep kind of rebelling and willfully turning away. Is the answer always more? Like, is there like we can do a lot of work with people and find out why they're acting the way they're acted, what happened in their childhood. We can direct them to better resources. But I think the thing I'm trying to get across here is we discern so often so that we can label things for our comfortability, when what we should be doing in discernment is labeling things, or not labeling things. We should be unearthing truth so that we can love and act in a righteous manner. So I guess is the difference labeling versus loving. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. And I guess that actually creates, it actually digs for what's underneath my statements here. It's fear. It's ultimately fear. I don't want to be wrong. Now, when I say that, I'm like, no, I want to be a learner. But I don't want to be wrong. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to waste my time. And I don't want to be hurt, And so I have, anybody that's in ministry a long time, if you're even entertaining the idea, and by ministry I don't mean profession, but you're really trying to serve people, care for people, you've had experiences where you poured into somebody your money, your time, your energy, your care, your prayers, your attention, and then they do something terrible, or they just ignore you all of a sudden, or they go the opposite direction that you're trying to encourage them to go. And you just feel like, how many people have dated said, that was 3 years of my life I can't get back because I wasted that time. And part of it's because the relationship ended, but there's also part that they're like, I thought we were building something important. Mm-hmm. So even if you've never been, quote, in ministry, you can relate to that idea. I thought we were building this friendship. I thought that was important, and now it's taken away. So now it's like, I guess I was wrong for 3 years. I'm now hurt, and I now feel like I've wasted my time. And I think that's what it is. And what's interesting, I immediately go to Jesus with Judas. Like, if I was that, I always wish you'd have a not a gospel, but a story, the next Dead Sea Scroll discovery, where it's like Jesus' friend Tom, who took notes, and he never believed the message. He was just taking notes from a friend's perspective. And his perspective, I think, would be, all right, I accepted Jesus was going to choose these 12, which was stupid to me, because I'm like, you'd rather have a congregation of 500 than 12, but you take these 12, and then they're all running, and then one guy betrays you. What a waste of time, my friend Jesus, Mm-hmm. But we see that. Well, I don't know how we see it. I usually say, well, Judas fulfilled Scripture. You had to have somebody that knew where he was and betray him and this kind of thing. But it is like, if I did that, and the guy I was really reaching to and cared for and spent, he committed suicide right after he betrayed me to my death, mm-hmm. I would think, I might have been wrong about that. I might have wasted some time there. Mm. So it's helpful. It doesn't make it feel any better, but that's why. That's why I want to discern, because I don't want to make the same mistakes again. I don't want to, be wrong, waste my time, and I don't want to hurt. I really don't want to. I'm going to hurt. I don't want to do it unnecessarily.
Man, so I was listening. I was listening to Luke today, and they talk about the naming of the disciples, and then the Judas, the betrayer or the whatever. And I was reading that, and I was like, okay, why? It's always struck me as funny that they'll label Judas as this, and it's always been fascinating to me that they do that. And I've never really dove into why they do it, but I wonder if it comes from such a place of hurt. Of, man, I thought that we were so invested. He was our guy, and we know that the Gospels were all written within 50-ish years of the life of Jesus. And I still wonder, like, if you were to talk to the disciples now, like, would they write it exactly? Like, would they communicate, their feelings about Judas in the exact same way, or are those feelings so, like, do they feel like, even like, man, like, it feels so, like, even in the writing of the Gospels and the telling of the story of Jesus, is there part of them where they're struggling to be like, what Judas is such a waste. Judas is such a waste, and part of it there is so much waste there. But in another sense of like, I'm struggling to communicate my feelings, because there seems to be so much I think there is so much hurt there, and that kind of takes us far away from what we're talking about today. But you bringing that up it was something that was on my mind earlier. So I don't know.
No, I think that that's fascinating to me because I perceive that as just to distinguish himself. It's like Simon the Zealot.
But it gets the difference of, okay, if they're discerning between Judas and the other disciples, is it like, are they labeling him, or is it loving? Is it distinguishing between, hey, here's how to ultimately love a person, and here's how selfishly acting leads to death? And so I wonder for them, is it a love that they do it, or is it a way of coping with the pain? I don't know.
Yeah, and I think to deny that's a possibility would deny their humanity. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to not do that. It's interesting too, I've grown up with doubting Thomas, but the Bible never calls him doubting Thomas. He's a guy named Thomas that was a skeptic, and so you count that as doubt, but then we find out all of the apostles are doubting on one way or another. And when they wrote the book, it was after the fact, so they could have easily called him Thomas the doubter, but they didn't say that about Thomas. They didn't say Peter the denier, or whatever else you'd say. And I think that is fascinating. I've never thought about it before, is that idea of that emotion. It is identifying, but is that really necessary? Mm-hmm. To say Judas Iscariot, wouldn't that be enough? Because that's an identifier that would distinguish him, from the others. And so anyway, so that is interesting. So what perplexes you about this passage?
Man, my mind has just gone down a whole other road. So I'm going to have to kind of collect myself for a moment. Yeah, so this gets kind of touches a little bit on what we had talked about a little bit before. But the idea of progress. So in 29, all the people, even the tax collectors, when they had heard Jesus' words, acknowledged that God's way was right because they had been baptized by John. And so it's so fascinating to me to think about, okay, like think about these tax collectors, these people who are actively still, like, I mean, maybe they're reformed, maybe they've given it up, but like, I don't know how we read that. It seems like it's still a current profession of them. So you have these tax collectors who go out into the wilderness and are baptized, and they come back and they still live the same sort of life. If anybody knows the exact answer to this, they can write in and tell me if I'm really, really wrong. But I'm just processing out loud. This dynamic is so fascinating to me, that these tax collectors who are still seemingly tax collectors are on the right side of things still. And you would think that to be lumped into the right group versus the wrong group of the Pharisees, that like I've always like, when people in church settings have brought up, okay, Jesus ate with tax collectors and prostitutes, like, it was always a given that, well, none of those people were still actively doing
former.
It. Yeah, former. It was all former. Right. There was never ever a situation where it was always immediate, and it had always been on our 12-step program for a long time. But it's really interesting to me, just this timeline of you have these people that are baptized by John, believe enough in that, and they still get part of the message of Jesus, and they're still struggling. And it's not weird, because we all do that to some extent. But I guess it's just hard for me to wrap my mind around, because I so much of the time assume that if Jesus is going to discern and Jesus is going to categorize, that the people who are getting it right, then they're going to be getting it right more of the, I guess they'll be getting it more right than I get it right now, if that does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
And I wonder, for those at times, and I even wonder if our podcast gives this feel, is the message of right behavior is useless. It's kind of that feel.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Because there are a lot of people that are dying to themselves to make decisions they don't want to make, but they believe is of God. Now, they may be right and they may be wrong, whether it's truly of God. I'm not even, because we're talking about a billion variables there, but their spirit is right. I want to do this to honor God. And so when you cross these concepts, and it's not like it only shows up here, matter of fact, he's actually saying this is an aggregate of all these experiences I've had where, I'm just now describing it. But he had heard this for a while. John was this way, Jesus was this way, and he's finally just being very articulate about, he's finally being very articulate about, here is this, how this goes, here's what's happening here. And so that's really discouraging to the person that has really worked hard not to give in to their impulses, to be unkind or to be even judgmental, this kind of thing, but then recognizing, it's almost like the rich young ruler where he's like, I've done all these good things. He's just like, one more thing, the thing you don't want to do. Mm-hmm. And I think for the person that really defines himself by the performance, the thing they don't want to do is move into a space where they feel uncomfortable because they don't know how to perform. Mm-hmm. And this is a space, so in practical terms, so you're that guy that has really gone out of his way to honor God in your life in the way you've been taught, and you could translate it to, or transplant it to Jesus walking the earth today, and you're doing this, and you've gone to church every Sunday, and every time the door's open, you've gone on mission trips, you've done all this stuff, you've given your money, you've given your time, you've given your heart to people, but you don't know you're stuck. You know, you don't feel secure that you have eternal life, and you come to Jesus, and he's like, what I need you to do is do this crazy thing, which honestly, what he asked the rich young ruler to do, it's just as crazy now as it would be then. Like, all of his friends would say, you are completely the meanest person in the world to sell everything. Because if you're rich, you got a lot of employees, and all of a sudden everybody's out of a job. You know what I mean? And so this idea, it just seems so irresponsible and so haphazard. And that would be the very thing that you'd be uncomfortable with, because like, how do I exist in a space where everybody around me is still committing this sin and you're not condemning it? And I don't know what to do here. It's really hard to trust God in spaces where you're like, I know what right and wrong is, and this isn't right. Because that's what the Pharisees were saying. This isn't right.
Yeah, no, and I think, and it just gets back to that thing we've talked about so much, and it's just so, it's so, why do I do the things that I do? If I am choosing to give my time, my money, my resources to people, if I'm choosing to go to church, I'm choosing to do the right things. It's just, okay, well, you know, what is the reason? And it's just one of those things. It's a constant battle. I think even from really people who have been doing this for a long time, of it's so easy to give yourself over to like doing it for the accolades, or doing it because this is what your family has always done and you want the approval, or you're doing it, because you like, I mean, it's just so easy, even for people who have done it right 1,000 times. And this, I think this gets to the heart of why Jesus, take up your cross daily, because this is something that is, you've never arrived. You have simultaneously already arrived, Jesus already arrived for you. And so you've already arrived. So the pressure to arrive is off. But I'm starting to sound kind of high there. But it is.
No, I'm tracking.
No, but it is just one of those things that is this. Jesus is constantly looking at us, almost like an older brother, just being like, listen, like you keep adding to your weight. You think the weight that I want to add to you, that this area that I want you to take a step in, is so much heavier than what you're doing now. And I'm telling you, the burden that you've already picked up is so much heavier than what I'm trying to give you. And I think we talked about that recently. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. What exactly does that mean? It means that when we're trying to carry our own burden, we're trying to make it for ourselves, and we're trying to tread water with all the baggage that we have, and then Jesus comes and offers us a solution that seems to even add more to it. Jesus is not adding on to the stress. What he is trying to offer you is going to take away from the burden. It will provide very real life implications that might present as really difficult. But when we talk about the eternal, his burden, his yoke takes away the burden of what you've already been carrying around with you.
Yeah. So this reminds me. So yesterday before the funeral, I stopped by the church building we're renting, and I'm carrying a bunch of different things in. I'm having to drop off. I'm going to do this and that and the other. And I passed this cart, this like serving cart, on wheels. And my hands are totally full, and I'm holding stuff under my armpit, and this kind of thing. And I think for a millisecond, I could just lay this on the cart. I'm like, no, I've got it. So I get to the door. Well, my keys are in my pocket. So I'm clearly going to have to lay half this stuff on the ground. Of course, I can't lay it half down because I need the other hand. So I got to put it all on the ground. Mm-hmm. Then I got to search for the keys, do the deal, da-da-da-da-da-da. And if I just put it on the cart, it'd have been one fluid motion. It would have saved me 3 to 5 minutes. And time is at a premium at this space. And I'm like, not to minimize Jesus, but Jesus is like that robotic cart that has unlimited space, unlimited weight-bearing capabilities, that as long as you keep your hand on it, it's going to follow wherever, it's going to carry everything. And then you're freed up to deal with what's in front of you. But just carrying out this metaphor until it completely breaks down. But it's that idea that I'm carrying so much stuff that I feel I got to figure out, I got to know, I got to do this, that I'm not even able to respond to the thing right in front of me. Because to do that, I'd have to lay all this stuff down. And like death to self is literally saying where you lay it all down. You know what I mean? Because in order to die to yourself, you're not holding on to, like, you don't see people dying like, but I have to have all these things with me. You know what I mean? They're laying them down. And I think there's just something useful. I don't know if that particular picture resonates, but it is that, since it's so on my mind, I'm like, that's what I'm doing. When I come in, it's not an anti-discernment or anti-service or anti-being part of a church message. It's the where is your dependence message.
So I think about the idea, and we'll wrap up here in just a second. But so we think about all the right and good things that like the Pharisees did, and then you think about like the tax collector who has done a lot of horrible and terrible things, and you go, okay, what truly distinguishes them? It's that they did both the easier and the hard thing. Right? They've been like, both groups have been trying to make it. Both groups had been, had betrayed in many ways, betrayed their countrymen for their betterment, for their place in society, for power, for money. And the tax collectors who repent and truly turn away, they give up a lucrative career. They're still probably social pariahs amongst their people, and they no longer have a way of they no longer have their very lucrative career, and now they're like following a homeless guy who's going to get killed on a tree very soon. And I think about that burden seems so like, and you could see, if your priority is not, I'm going to lean into the weirdness and the awkwardness and the newness that God wants to offer me, it would be a radical, insane idea for the Pharisees to do it. And I mean, we're talking, I'm talking in circles here. But I just think it is so, you begin to think, like, for me, I touched on earlier, like, well, they're still tax collectors. They're still struggling with this ongoing thing. And I'm like, well, of course, like, almost, of course it like, for some people is an immediate, thing. I've got to give up this lifestyle. I've got to give up this thing. But for so many of us, like, we'll have that thing when we follow Jesus, like, okay, I've got to get away from that. That's so deeply unhealthy. But then there's another thing. There's another thing that we're going to struggle with for a year or 2 years or our entire life. And eventually maybe God will redeem that or, set us free from that. But there's always that next thing. And so, yeah, I'm struggling to wrap up here, and I feel like my thoughts are all jumbled. But I just find this incredibly beautiful and hopeful in so many different ways, that when Jesus is generalizing this generation, that the people that he defines as getting it haven't figured it all out yet. And Jesus wants them to act right and act out of love and have proper discernment. But the fact that they haven't fully arrived, but the fact that they're not trying, the fact that they haven't arrived means that they've arrived, and that is one of those mind-boggling things that I could sit with for a long time.
Mm-hmm. It is, and I always find myself led back to John 6:29, where it says, "The work of God is this, to believe the one He sent." And that to me is my saving grace, my sanity keeper. Is that, oh man, my head's spinning. It's like, wait a minute, there is value in doing good, and there is value in being consistent. There is value in all these things. Simultaneously, they have value right up to the moment that I trust them more than I trust Jesus. And that's the part that I have to keep. The only safeguard is continuing to ask, am I really trusting in Jesus in this? Or am I trusting in these things? Which is why study the Word is so important, because it allows you to see yourself in new light, which is what today is for me. I'm like, man, why did I do that funeral yesterday? And why am I going to small group tonight? And why am I, this kind of thing, to continually keep that. And the key here is, if I discover I'm doing this for all selfish motivation, that doesn't mean I just let it go. It means I now have a choice to make a new choice. I was going to do that selfish motivation. That would have made me look good. Now I'm choosing to do it because I love Jesus, because all I have is this moment, and that dynamic of just being committed to, oh, I need forgiveness. I accept your forgiveness, God. And now I'm going to lean into you right now.
Thank you for listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. We're so grateful that you would choose to listen to us, that you would put us in your ears. That's a very intimate and cool thing that we get to be a part of.
That's right.
Grace, peace, and love.